Hi, everybody. Welcome back to part two of the Digital Equity in Teacher Education and Professional Development webinar hosted by ISTE's Digital Equity PLN. Today we have returning panelists. I'm going to go ahead and have you say your names and introduce each of yourselves so I make sure not to massacre your names. But we're all here in wonderful form, and also we do have Carla Jefferson, Abby Futrell, sorry, here with us in spirit, and will return to join us for part three of the series. On our last webinar, we actually focused on 5 questions, and tonight we'd like to delve a little bit deeper into 3 of those questions while responding to your questions and comments. If you're live tweeting, we'd like to remind you to tag at DigEquityPLN. So let's start with our first question. Over to you, Bettina. Let you guys all introduce yourselves. Can we start with that first?
Sure, that sounds good. So I'm Bettina Shea. I am an assistant professor at Cal State Long Beach in the Department of Teacher Education.
Hey y'all, I'm Raina Leone. I'm the director of the Single Subject Credential Program over at St. Mary's College. I'm also an associate professor there.
Hello, everybody. I am Carla Jefferson. I am an instructional technology coordinator for the Darlington County School District, which is a school district in rural South Carolina.
All right, and I'm up for question 1. So thank you, Marisol, for introducing us all. So last time we talked through ideas on how we might achieve digital equity and bridge the gap between teacher education and districts. So what are some of our new wonderings, or what new observations have we made about digital equity in the last couple months? And more specifically, how does it look in our own district and university settings?
I think one of the questions that I ask myself, and that's because I do work closely with our first-year teachers. For our district, we call them our Project Teach teachers. And so frequently, I think they're overwhelmed in general with just everything that they have to do. But especially if they're not comfortable with the technology, wondering how far in the teacher education program, is technology talked about as far as like using it for instruction in the classroom, and in what different ways. I actually am a guest speaker at one of our local universities, Francis Marion, every semester. And what they currently have is like a using technology in the classroom course, which I think is a great place to start. But what we frequently see, and this is not just with our new teachers, but in general, is that continual separation that either technology is like extra, especially if we're talking about things that require critical thinking or higher order thinking skills, that every child doesn't have access to that. And we're in a one-to-one district, so device access is not a problem. But either they see it as an opportunity for a reward or free time, or is seen as something extra. And so like, I think having those conversations before they come to us, because when they come with really good questions when they interview now, like, what is your technology plan look like? What devices do teachers have? What devices do students have? Which I think is extremely powerful. But getting them, like, where do we start with the conversation of that the technology and the content go hand in hand, and it's not an additional piece?
I know for my candidates, it's exactly that. I work with credential candidates who are in the beginning of their processes. And for many of them, it is, so wait, you want me to do something different than what I've done in the past myself, not just to lecture, right? But wait, my PowerPoint is so beautiful. And my presentation is so beautiful. And this is what I think of technology, is consumption of knowledge through a technological frame. So the PowerPoint as a vehicle for technological experience and depth. And it's like, no, that's like one component, but like, how are you also preparing your students to learn skills of using technology for themselves and becoming producers, not just consumers? And it's not, as you said, it's an integrated part of the content. It's part of living within this 21st century. So how do we nurture that too, when for many of our students, and in my case, students is teacher candidates who are going to be teachers, of like, this is another necessary skill that has to be a part of your work. In my program, we don't have a technology course, and it's our technology approach is very integrative. So they are exposed to multiple projects like project-based learning and or tasks rather, as far as creating PBL units, for example, where they are supposed to be drawing from real life experiences, arts, technology, and then developing a curriculum that actually supports the choice and voice of their students, right? And that is the stretch. It's definitely a stretch for them. So by the end of the program, I know many of them are thinking more about like the job pitch, like, I use technology, I do, rather than like, how do I help my students in the long run, not just for the glitz and glamour and gold of it. But it's something that I also recognize it's developmental, that for many of them, that is the start of thinking more deeply about their practice, including or exploring digital equity within their work.
I think the other thing I'm mindful of when I hear you, so I as well, I teach at the university level, and then I'm at the district, so I have new teachers, right? And we're trying to help them re-envision ways to get information and use technology. And the assumption often is that the more veteran teachers are resistant to using technology, right? You're shaking your head, right? Because you know what I'm talking about. And so I think what I've seen, and I'm curious to see if you agree with this, they're really good at using technology for me, right? I'm really good at using, all these different apps for what I need. But to use it to teach and to instruct and to guide students, I think is really, really critical. And so getting us to understand, how does my pedagogy, what do I do now with this new technology? Because kids and students and education in general, no longer should it be, do you know the date that this happened, right? Do you know the person and where they're from? Because you can Google that. You can ask Siri those questions. Kids aren't interested. So I think, how do they re-envision? And so here's something that I'm thinking of, and I want to ask you guys, and maybe you can help me unpack this, because I'm struggling a little bit with this, because I work with 20 coaches that help teachers, right? We purposefully did not have a technology coach. And the reason we thought was because technology shouldn't be a separate entity. It should be integrated. And I hear that when you talk about the choices that schools of education make, right? But in the absence of having somebody coach technology and help you transition from traditional teaching to, technology-infused teaching, how do you get people to do that if they don't know the basics and if they don't have the support? So I'm struggling, and we talk about the SAMR model, the substitute, augment, and so forth. And so I'm struggling with, shouldn't we have people to just help them know just the basics so that they can say, I'm going to plan this unit. Hey, I remember when I tried this, and I can apply it. Otherwise, I don't think that they know that that's a potential road to take for a lesson plan. So anyway, I know I'm asking more questions and giving answers, but they're just kind of observations I've made that I kind of ask myself often,
I think you're exactly right. And that's one of the things that's kind of where I see problems with trying, when you talk about the curriculum piece. Like, so we'll say, oh, you can use Padlet to, collect students' responses. And they're like, well, what's Padlet? And so there's that right now, because we're like, this is our first year of being totally one-to-one. So, you know, like we have had it in shifts. So we went 3-to-1, 2-to-1, 1-to-1. And so we have teachers that have been one-to-one for anywhere from 3 to 5 years, and some that are brand new with students having consistent access to devices. And so I find myself frequently going back to the how to, like how to set up an account, how to use the tool. And so by the time, with the limited time that I have, then we don't even get to the like the content piece that, you know, that really seems to currently be our current struggle. But, you know, we have kind of designed next year's professional development where there is a curriculum expert, and then there's also someone who's really good with curriculum instruction, but also has that tech savvy piece to be in that session together. So that is for our district PD days, it's an all-day session so that, yes, we can talk about the content and the pedagogy. And we're going to frequently refer back to TPAC this year, so that we're having conversations about the pedagogy piece. And then this is the technology tool that can help you do this. But before we get into you actually practicing with that, we're going to put a little how-to piece, you know, in there too. But I also want to go back to something that both you, Marisol, and Raina said, is that I think part of the problem is that we teach the way we were taught. And so if we don't see in our teacher prep programs professors that are using those tools with students in that way, it's kind of hard for them to make the shift too. And exactly like, you know, what you said, we call our students digital natives, but that means that they know how to use it for social media. They don't know how to use it for instructional purposes, and that's our responsibility. You know, just like we give kids crayons and they scribble, you know, or colored pencils, but they still have to be taught to draw the letters. I mean, those are all pieces that we sometimes forget about. So I have seen districts that have gotten away from technology coaches and curriculum coaches, and now they just have coaches, but they still find themselves struggling if the how-to piece isn't there. Like, how do I set up this account? How do I use this tool first, like just for basic how-to before I begin to use it with students? And it's just, I'm sure for a lot of them, it gets to be overwhelming. And they're like, well, yeah, I'm just not going to do that because I've got my hands full enough already with what I'm already doing.
Well, and that applies to teacher educators too, right? So, you know, there, as far as the skill capacity of many teacher educators, oftentimes, I don't know if this is true for many y'all, but there's like one person and you're the tech person. And because you love technology and you're assigned to that class, you're not assigned to the class because it doesn't exist, but you're the tech person. And everyone reaches out to that one tech person for any answers when it's been communicated within a teacher education department around the importance of integration. But you can't integrate if there's only one person holding the knowledge. So this piece, the importance of also teaching the teachers who will teach the teachers and then their students. So I know for myself, like I do a lot of work with my teacher candidates around like, here's something that I've created for you as a student. Now, how will you apply this for your practice as a teacher? Like seeing both sides of the coin within a practice. And it's something, at least at my university, that we're also talking very deeply about, of creating more professional learning communities with one another around technology and augmenting our practices. So how do we build and really think deeply about digital equity and support of teacher candidates who are going out into the field? But that too is its own process. So it makes sense that our candidates are also experiencing tension when some of the exposure that they have to, in my practice at least, is to consumption, not always to production.
So I know we're on time and things like that, and we want to move to question 2. But I'm really still wanting to respond to question 1 a little bit about digital equity and teacher education and kind of what I've been seeing in terms of schools and districts, because I actually have been able to supervise this semester. And so it's really interesting because my whole perspective on digital equities and in the supervision process has been really interesting because I have student teachers out in the field. And one of the things I have encountered that I hadn't encountered before is StudySync, which is, this digital platform where it's basically like an interactive reader, but it's digital, right? And I think one of the things that's really interesting about that is it's a form of technology, but it's almost like it is just a worksheet based form of technology, right? And it's not really teaching students to use digital resources in thoughtful ways. And she didn't have a lot of tech in her pre-service training. And so I kind of goes back to what Raina was saying just a minute ago. I am the tech person, right? They take a separate tech class that has to do with technology, but that's in a different department. And then in teacher ed, like I am the one tech person. And we are a very large program. So we're one of the largest programs in the state of California, and the state of California educates a lot of teachers. And so to be the only real tech person in teacher ed in a very large program, and right now I'm only teaching one pre-service class. If they don't get it, they don't get a whole lot of tech integration. And to me, that's a huge digital equity issue, right? Because then how do they actually get into classrooms, right? And actually get into districts, and how do they stop using it just as a selling point? Like, oh, I can use this one specific app or this one specific tool without really thinking pedagogically about why they would use that again. So I don't want to say too much more because I know we're moving towards question 2, but I did notice that Regina asked from Twitter whether professors are held accountable for integrating technology. And it's now part of our College of Ed strategic plan, but there's not really accountability per se, because it's hard to hold professors accountable for a certain thing in academia. So I don't know, not where I am for sure.
So one thing, as far as, if not professors, programs are, because technology is a part of the Commission on Teacher Credentialing's standards. And so programs through our accreditation cycles are required to report on how the standards are appearing within our syllabuses, within our classes, within our practices. And that's really where the state can hold us accountable as a collective program for our practices. And so that's definitely something that has to be reported out. And there's a whole matrix and everything for reporting that out. But my school is receiving a visit next year, so I'm very well versed in that. But I know it's time for us to transition to question 2, which is on part 1 of this series. We talked about encouraging educators to leverage the technology they have access to in order to improve learning opportunities for their students. So can y'all share a time when you witnessed the transfer of digital equity knowledge from your own teaching to the learner's application in their practice or learning?
Well, I think, am I on here? One of the things I want to say is I'm one of those veteran teachers, right? I'm in my 50s. And I recall when computers getting into my classroom. As a matter of fact, I was doing my master's. I had one computer in the classroom, and my master's thesis was how to use, or basically how to make the most of a one computer classroom so that every single student got on that computer, right? At one point, at least during the week. And we had computer labs that you'd go once a week, right? Which was a total joke, but it was something. And I remember being afraid to use a computer. And I remember my husband said to me, that's your problem. If you're afraid of this computer, then that's the issue. And it was a turning point for me to realize that I need to tackle this. And so I see that. And what I've noticed is that once you start seeing what technology can do and how it can help you, you're hooked, because it definitely makes your life easier, doesn't it? Right? as teachers. So to be able to use different software, different applications, just to manage the myriad of things that we have to do as teachers, right? Whether it be report cards or grading and all of that, there's a buy-in. And now all of a sudden I can see that there's a reason why this is compelling. Then when I see it being used as a tool to get kids to, get motivated to learn and to explore and spark, then I want more and I want more. And so as an adjunct faculty, right, at universities, I started using Google Slides because I felt it was the one place we could journal about things. I could give instant feedback. I could model how they should use, this in their classroom. And I was so surprised because for the most part, they were in their 20s. And they were so frustrated with how to share documents, how to make a copy so they didn't write over the original. All those things happened. And I realized, man, if this doesn't happen in teacher education and, learning how to become a teacher, how long before they become motivated? My husband told me, stop being afraid. And that made me brave enough to move forward. But if they don't have a person to do that, or if they don't have experiences, right, that make them do that and get motivated to see the bonus of using technology, then how many years is it going to take? Because I don't think it's going to happen at their schools. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it will. But I do see that teacher education is definitely an important place for it to start.
And one thing is, as far as like that bare bones kind of knowledge too, with so doing a technology survey, where are the plugs in the room, y'all? Like, what access do you have to iPads or Chromebooks or whatever is at your school site? Does the projector work, or do you have to write a grant to get a projector in the first place? So a technology survey is what's available in your classroom, what's available in your department and at your school site, and what kind of access you have. Because I remember back when I was teaching in Las Vegas, and there were many labs. There were like 4 or 5 labs in this huge school, and most people used it like once, maybe every month. It was so hard to book because we were such a big school. And then thinking about the other part of a tech survey, which is a survey of the people in the room. What kind of tech skills do they have? So what access do they have? So do they have smartphones? What apps are they using on their smartphones? What are they using them for? All of that. So that can inform one's teaching, because you need to know as a teacher who's in the room as far as their knowledge base, and that includes technology stuff. So going through that process with a lot of my teacher candidates, for me, it's always a surprising an interesting observation of them in their practice when they start to realize, oh, my students don't know all the tech stuff now, and they can't teach me. I actually have to teach them. And what do they know? And what do I have to grow to know to be able to support their burgeoning skills and knowledge? So, but they have to like have the tools to gain that knowledge first before they can start to think about, what do I have to do as a teacher?
I think about 2 years ago, probably now, I had my coworker at the time. She was our social studies teacher, and she had been doing project-based learning for a long time with her students. And towards the end of the school year, she was in an accident that prevented her from being able to come back to school and finish out the school year. So every year, the culminating project was for students to create their own music videos based on social studies content. And we were determined that we were going to continue that for her, that process. And although, my 3 colleagues and I had used, we had been in a one-to-one iPad situation for 2 years now. And it was obvious that we all used it differently. I almost lost my mind because at that point, it's like a lack of control. And so, I'm just so used to controlling everything. And if you've got you know, a group, like a classroom of students, and you got 5 different groups that are doing projects that are recording music videos, they can't all do that sitting in that classroom. Some are in another classroom, some are down the hall, some, and I mean, like, that for me was probably a true testament of being able to release control in order to allow them to create. Because I was like, where are you going? No, you can't. I can't see you. You can't go. And they're like, how can we, you know, like, I mean, like, they have choreography and everything, you know, so it's like, how do I, you know, I mean, so that was a huge shift in, like, you have students that are capable. I mean, and they're 6th graders, they're 12. So you're always afraid of what's going to happen when they go around the corner. But you have students that are at different varying levels of even just the type of release control, you know, release and control that you can do over them and what they're allowed to do. And when I tell you that I'm blown away every year by the work that they do, you know, I am. So I figure, you know, it's, they come back and they produce something. So obviously they were, you know, being effective. But I think it also goes back to seeing it. Like, I knew about it, like I saw the finished product, or even like as they were towards the end after they had put everything together. But being able to see that process from beginning to end changed my viewpoint. And even when we first decided to go one-to-one, I'm an English teacher. So, you know, and I'm thinking, okay, my kids need to know how to read and write. What are they going to do on a device for 55 to 60 minutes a day? You know, it doesn't make sense to me. And so we went to go visit a school district that had been the one-to-one for some time. And for me to see that, you know, they don't use the devices for every minute of every day when they're in the classroom, that sometimes they are using them and sometimes they aren't. And this was 5 or 6 years ago. It changed my thinking. So I think, again, it's kind of going back to what Marisol said, is that we have to provide opportunities for all of them, you know, whether they're in, I mean, I think that the earlier that we can do that, the better, if we can do it in the teacher education program. But like those veteran teachers, for them to see someone else who is doing it effectively and seeing that, you know, this can work for all of our students. And it's not fair for me to hold them back because of my uncomfortability, you know, because of my uncomfortableness, sorry, then that's gonna that's how you change the tone and change, you know, the way things can make that shift. So,
you know, I also,
I agree. It's so important that that people have the opportunity, right, to engage with the technology if we really want them to use it. And my like big tool that I use all the time consistently in my classrooms is Twitter. And I actually then study students' Twitter use, like my teacher candidates' Twitter use when they leave my classroom. And that's actually been really fulfilling in terms of digital equity, and like looking at the ways that my teachers, some of them 4 and 5 years out, are actually using Twitter as a communication tool to build their own PLNs, to actually engage with other educators, to live tweet professional developments that they're at, to show what their students are doing. It's really great to actually see, you know, this transfer of knowledge, right? And this actual opportunity when, like, it's not a requirement as part of their course. It's actually something that they're really engaged in as professionals. And it's this transfer of knowledge, and they're highlight a lot of different forms of technology that they're using, some of which I modeled for them and some of which I didn't. But making a difference in some way, that the things that you're actually doing are impacting beyond your classroom. And so that's been a really, really great kind of transfer of digital equity knowledge, like from theory to practice, that I've been able to kind of see in the teacher education realm. Like, right, you actually see teachers as they're becoming teachers using it still to think through things with their professional communities.
One of the things I wanted to share, I had stated that I work with some coaches, right? So we all in California, we got this educator effectiveness money for districts, And so our district did a needs assessment, and we discovered we were going to get coaches. And pretty much each coach goes to 3 schools and they support. They're all at different ends of the spectrum in terms of their years in a career. Some have been 20 plus, others are just at the beginning. Their ability to use technology is just as varied. But I remember clearly saying, you should each have your own web page. And I could tell some of them had never done that and wanted support. And so I said, we're going to have Wes in the district and a few of his friends come and help us. And so having that differentiated support, because some were able to fly with it and create this really cool website page, right? Others were like, oh my gosh, I can't believe, they were shaking, right? So the fact that they all sat in different places, and then later on when that other person, that outsider, came to help them, then they helped each other because they all had to do that, right? And so then later on, we created opportunities to just share, well, what do you use that's helped you and why do you use it? And the why was critical. Why am I using Screencastify? Why am I sharing a little link on a video and a newsletter? Why is it that I'm doing that? And I think when we come together as educators, that's where the learning happens, because we start going, oh, wow, that's pretty cool. How'd you do that? Right? And that's when I think we see a lot of application of knowledge, because we're all know the why, and we're helping each other get there in more interesting ways.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation for me, because especially just because I don't get a chance to have conversations with people who work closely with teacher prep programs. So we're going to go ahead and switch over to our third question. And so we discussed several barriers to achieving digital equity in our work with new and current teachers. So what advice might we give to current teacher educators or professional development leaders who are working to prepare and support teachers in their own digital equity efforts?
So I can start with this one. I think the first thing is you can't teach what you don't know, right? So I think Raina talked about this a little earlier. If as teacher educators, we want students and we think that it is valuable for students to actually, engage digitally, which they're going to do anyways. But if we want to have them productively engage digitally for academic purposes, then we have to know how to do that. We have to model it and we have to be able to teach it. So I think there's that, right? And then I think the other piece of advice is to remember, to never forget or never take your eye off of equity when we're teaching about digital practices, right? Because I think it's easy for us to get focused on the tools, right? And then not get focused on whose voices are in or out of the conversation. And I think it's been super powerful for me as an educator and a teacher educator watching what's been happening recently with the March for Our Lives movements, the Enough movement, right? This leadership that's come out of Parkland. And not only that, but I think the students that are leading that movement have been really clear to decenter themselves and actually bring up issues of digital equity, right? Like they're bringing up the fact that, oh, well, we are white and privileged, or there's more focus on us because we have privilege, right? Even though they're not all white, but the majority of the Parkland students who have been focused on they're, obviously Emma Gonzalez is not, but, they're like, well, a quarter of our school is African-American, and you didn't show that. Right. And I think it's, again, a place where we as teachers and teacher educators need to learn from our youth. And we need to remember that there are going to be equity issues when we teach digitally, and we can't just ignore those, but they're not necessarily the equity issues that we have ingrained in our mind, right? Because I think sometimes we think the equity issues are only about access or only about, digital native versus, being a novice, or what types of technology you have access to. But there's actually access to whose voice gets heard and how the media portrays you and how the media portrays your particular use of technology. And so I think these are some of the issues. These are some of the things that I would, advise teacher educators to keep in mind, right, is one, we got to keep constantly working to develop ourselves and be asking ourselves why we're doing things, but also that we need to be constantly critical of our own practices and the ways that that we're thinking about digital use in our classrooms and in the classrooms of others.
I think one of the things that was eye-opening for us when we went through our accreditation process is that, so we built, oh gosh, 10 years ago now, we built two new schools, and we added on to an additional school. And of course, then we were in a place where we put Promethean boards in 50% of the classrooms. All classrooms have a projector. All classrooms had a sound system. And so 3 years later, when we went through that accreditation process, we realized that the Promethean board was being used mainly by teachers. And that did not count towards technology usage. And so then we go back, here we are up for our accreditation again. And we have to have the conversations about the fact that it's not what the teacher does. It is what the student does with the technology that is what the accreditation group looks for. And so like having those conversations, so for us, it's not what I can do with Google Slides, or like you said earlier, Raina, how beautiful my PowerPoint is or my flip chart is. It is what students are doing with technology that's going to make the difference, ties back into that equity piece. And I think I love the comment, Bettina, that you said about it's also about who has access for their viewpoints and their thoughts being heard. And so again, that goes back into that piece, like who has the opportunity to create and build and share their knowledge is so I'm 1-to-1, but I've got 5 kids who only use that device for test prep, or I have 5 other kids who are allowed to create based on their learning. Like that's an equity problem. I have a teacher friend, a colleague who has gone back into like her special ed self-contained classroom. Her students participated in the hour of code. And she had kids that successfully completed that process, where before you would have teachers to say, oh, my kids can't do that. So you find gifts that children have, it's just like the arts in general. So a child struggles with reading a math, but they're a beautiful flutist, but we don't give them the opportunity to participate in band because they need test prep. So I think, going back to those conversations about how having those conversations, and again, the earlier we can have those conversations, the better. With, how can I shift my thinking? And also, sometimes they go into schools where they meet resistance to that. So how can I adequately display or, share what I know to be right for all students in the face of opposition, so that I can do what's best for children, so that each child can achieve their own individual best. How can I, like we teach children to be advocates for themselves. How as a first year teacher am I going to be an advocate for what I know is best that I've learned, in my teacher prep program, without somebody saying, no, you need to grab the textbook and start with page 1 and then go to page 2. How do we help them to build that sense of confidence without them seeming like they're being oppositional in that new space that they're going to find themselves after they leave you?
Well, I think that some of the things that we've talked about around the Parkland students and social media strategies. So I think that actually deserves to be taught within a classroom, of being able to engage in critical media literacy practices and read the media that's being produced and question it, but also think about what are the strategic moves that have been used to communicate effectively with an outside audience, and how can young people, youth, also be involved in movement building in the democratic process, even without their vote. before they engage in that become able to vote. And I think that, there are some things too around helping teachers to recognize that, again, just because you're an incredible scientist doesn't mean that you can't also teach students how to, how to engage with the world and how to communicate effectively with technology. And whether that's a shared lab report, or that is using Twitter to talk with other scientists, or that's using an iPad app to look at the quality of water and use that information to gird one's political moves of like protecting the water, because thinking about water as right of human, the same value of life, because water is life. Then how do you help the students to also have that engagement? And that goes for our teacher candidates too, of like, how do you actively engage within an online community that is appropriate and professional and supportive, rather than another model of what youth may experience in like a cyberbullying kind of culture. So how do you make sure that those networks and those exchanges do not shift into toxicity because of the illusion of anonymity or of distance? So, and I think that translates into our professional practice as well, because we're human beings, and sometimes we don't always use technology for its best effects.
One of the things I would imagine to tell professional development providers, because most of them, let's say, are working within a school district, right? I'd be thinking that how can we create spaces to share the why and the how of moving to other ways of instructing, right? So, and when I say share spaces, I mean create professional development that is ongoing, job embedded, right, at the source. Not I'm going to go to a PD session and go back to my classroom, but creating spaces that where school is seen as a community of learners, whether you're a teacher or a student, and that as teachers and all of us, we work together to make ourselves better, right? And that part of that is me helping you understand how you might be able to integrate technology. So I would say, as professional development providers, how do we move away from the sit and get to the real, work of working together as professionals? For teacher education, my thought would be that we're training teachers to understand this teaching context where we've moved away from information scarcity, where the teacher was the keeper of the knowledge, right? We'd go to school because the teacher knew the information. Then that started to move because now we had encyclopedias, and oh, look, I can look it up in an encyclopedia. Well, now guess what? There's so much information, so much is inaccurate, so much has to be vetted and, researched. So as a teacher, it's really, how do I facilitate you now getting the information to figure out and weigh what's being said out there, because it's not scarce. Information is not scarce. There's an overload of it. So as teacher educators, I think part of our job is that as well, is to recognize that technology can hurt and help. And so it's a pretty awesome responsibility, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's really hard because I think Raina said this at the beginning of the conversation. There's so much to cover in a teacher education program, and so few units and courses in which to cover that information that now we're being held accountable for, at least at the program level. And so it's kind of figuring out, how do we integrate these things cohesively? So I think, reminding teacher educators, reminding professional development coordinators to be thinking in integrated ways, right? To not be thinking of technology and I mean, this gets back to what all of you said kind of at the beginning of this conversation, to not be thinking of technology as the adjunct to write content, but how do we actually think about things as integrated? How do we think of technology and equity as integrated? How do we think about technology and pedagogy as integrated? I mean, everything together. And I think that's developmentally really challenging within pre-service teacher education, but also for teacher educators who, I mean, this is not, I mean, people don't usually teach us to be teacher educators, first of all, and then we teach how we've been taught, you know, many of us. And so I think there's just a lot. So I also would probably give the advice to people, you know, start where you're at and move forward, right? Because I think it does get really overwhelming when you see, I mean, we're not all at the same developmental level when we talk about digital practice or digital equity. And I think it's important to, this is just my motto in life. I think it's important to be kinder to ourselves and to each other because it's hard. You know, this work is actually really, really hard. So I just wanted to throw that in too, because I think sometimes, you know, I think about where I want to be next, and then I want to give that advice. And that advice isn't always appropriate to somebody who's not where I'm at, right? So I think it's just keeping that perspective as well.
And one thing I want to add, as you said, Bettina, around being kinder, is the role of the teacher educator, the teacher, and ultimately the student in responsible communication through technology, such as recognizing that we are in tumultuous times and that the images of Black and Brown peoples killed, but those images circulated over and over through social media can, for some, be used for activating movement and can also be conduits of great trauma and great grief. So this underlying that is a concern around or the issue of being responsible and clear about what's one's intentionality, and thinking about the impact, not just the intent behind one's decision making in digital usage. And I think that goes to earlier conversations too. Marisol was talking about like the why. So why are you using that link? Why are you using this image? Why are you coming to this conclusion? And I think that's incredibly important in our conversations of digital equity and technology usage.
But I think it, you know, like I think it was said earlier about like there's so much to do. Like once they enter the teacher education program, what I think about frequently is that when I talk to my high school teachers and that they say that the students are rebelling, they're pushing back on the critical thinking piece. You know, like they are struggling because they have spent by that time 10, 11 years playing school. Like they've got that school thing down. You know, I can sit there and if my hand is in the right place up under my chin and I tilt my head the right way, the teacher really believes that I'm all involved in what they're saying, when really I'm thinking about what's for lunch today. You know, like they've got that down. And so when they're forced and they're pushed to think critically, you know, and so that the answers aren't Google easy, you know, so now we're working to retrain their minds and force them to work a little bit harder than they have worked. But they leave us and they go to a 2 or 4 year college where they're kind of like back at square one, right? So then they spend 2 years of going back to the way that they've been. You know, if I sit still and smile and nod my head, I'm okay. And then they hit that teacher education program that's then pushing them back into that space. It's a vicious cycle. And so but you know, as you said, many of you are the one tech person, you know, in your department. And sometimes maybe even like that ratio may be larger than that. Like, how do we help our professors get to the point where they change what they're doing a little bit so that it's not such hard, cold water showers that they're not kids, they're young adults that are getting as they continue to make these, you know, these transitions. And I know that's a question that nobody here probably has the answer to. That's a bigger problem than any of us are individually equipped to handle. But, you know, like, we frequently hear that the kids aren't coming ready. And I do believe that for a huge extent, you know, to a certain extent. But also, like, if we're changing our pedagogy, then somebody else has got to change their pedagogy further down, you know, the line too. So.
Okay, so there's so much I can say about all the things you just mentioned. But I'm going to, and this does kind of align with what you said, but also a little bit as well to what Bettina said, because there's so much that needs to be done in so few classes, right? And I'm concerned. I'm concerned that we are allowing people to become teachers in a heartbeat. I mean, I think so many, and I know all of you have been to different universities, worked at different universities in different capacities, or attended them, whatever it is. We all have that firsthand knowledge. And it has gone from what I would say, you know, preparing to be a professional educator to preparing to be a professional educator on, like, as fast as you can. And so I've seen that we have courses, I'll just give an example, that could be 5 weeks long. And people are meeting 4 hours a week for 5 weeks, or, you know, as an example. And how is that possible? Like, you know, how do you get to know true methodology and deep understanding of whatever it is that you're teaching for teacher education in a very short amount of time? And I'm afraid that there's another message that comes with that you can learn how to be a teacher on, you know, on speed dial. And I just don't think that's possible. And I think it's frightening when a profession as important as teaching is also undergoing those changes that's just making it a quick road to teaching credential. It's a concern, right? And there's got to be a loss when you do that. So anyway, I'll leave it there.
Well, it seems like it might be that time to start closing and saying how people can contact us afterwards. Because at least for, there were so many questions that also came from this conversation. So it also seems like we should do another conversation online. But at least for me, a way to contact me is on Twitter. So I'm at Profesora Leon, PROFESORA Profesora Leon, professor in Spanish Leon. And on email, rjl6@stmarys-ca.edu. So how about y'all?
Sure, I'll go next. So also on Twitter at Prof Shea, PROFHSIEH. So last name again is HSIEH. So it's at Prof Shea, at PROFHSIEH, and easily look upable. But my email address is my first name dot my last name at csculb.edu.
Okay, I am at Mrs. MRS Jeff to you, Mrs. Jeff to you on Twitter, and email is Mrs. MRS JEFF, the number 2 letter U at gmail.com.
I can just imagine you're saying to somebody, "That's Mrs. Jeff to you." I just can totally see it. I would say it's easy. First name dot last name at gmail.com. Marisol, MARISOL dot REXACH at gmail.com. Thank you for all joining us tonight. Appreciate the panelists for giving me for not butchering your names and so elegantly allowing that not to happen. I bless you all for that. That's our time. So please keep watch in the ISTE community and on Twitter at Dig Equity PLN. for the official date of Part 3, which will be a joint effort between ISTE's Digital Equity PLN and the Teacher Education Network. We actually look forward to returning as your panelists along with Abby Cottrell. Looking forward to seeing her again. Rochelle Poth, President-elect for the Teacher Education Network, and Jennifer Cordiff. Special thanks to Sarah. Hey, Sarah, thank you so much, Sarah Thomas, for the support in the background tonight. Thanks to ISTE's Digital Equity PLN and co-chairs Nicole Howard and Regina Schaefer for nudging us to keep this conversation going. Until next time, guys, good night.
Good night.
Good night.